Dead on Your Feet, Arthur Grant Michaels, St. Martin's Press, New York, 1993. Stan Kraychik Mystery, Book 3, narrator Eric Aust. In memory of Tajana and Andre, with gratitude and respect and love, thanks to the patience and generosity of my friends. Chapter 1. Shall we dance? I think my lover is killing me. I don't mean literally with a knife or a gun or poison. It's a more refined yet relentless termination of my life the way it was before I knew him. Not that there was so much to kill. My existence was mostly work and home. Work and home. The dull routine broken by an occasional quiet evening with a few close friends, or the rare night of reckless frolic with a noisy gang of heavy drinkers. But at the heart of it, despite the patient love of my friends, despite the extreme social nature of my work as a hairstylist, despite the enduring love of my family and the vague love of my pet, I was lonely for another kind of love. Physical passion had been dormant so long, my nether regions were feeling wizened. Then along came Rafik, that's his name, rhymes with technique, who quickly relieved the anguish of physical loneliness. The cure, however, was not without complication. It was late March, a rare blue sky morning to mark the first day of spring. An all-night rain had scrubbed the air and left it sweet. Boston weather had passed that critical point where we natives can safely put away our scarves, gloves, and mucklucks. Put all of it back into storage until next winter, which, on the first day of spring in New England, is honestly only 6 short months away. I was on my way to work, to Snip's Salon on the posh lower end of Newbury Street, just around the corner from the Public Garden and the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. I was early and I knew I had no customers booked that morning, so I decided to pay a surprise visit to Rafik, where he works at the studios of the Boston City Ballet, deep in the South End. Rafik had been a dancer in Montreal until he injured his hip in a nasty fall during rehearsal 5 years ago. I hadn't met him yet, but sometimes I wish I had, so that I could have nursed him back to health. He was in his late 20s, just entering the mature phase of his performing career. The best years, but his destiny had abruptly changed course in that moment when an old moving van had backfired wildly outside of the studio, and Rafik had lost his precious concentration during his third revolution in midair, and gravity had taken over. He landed badly from the complex aerial tour, crashed directly onto the pelvic crest of his right hip, and cracked it clear through to the ball and socket joint. The injury no longer affects his everyday life, but for a performer of classic dance, where at any moment the body's equilibrium might be directed by only 3 or 4 muscle fibers, that kind of injury was the death knell. So to remain with his art, Rafik turned to choreography and teaching outwardly. He seemed satisfied with the decision, yet I sensed that some part of his psyche was scarred and desensitized. Some aspect of his emotional growth arrested when his life on stage was interrupted in its progress to artistic fruition. Perhaps that's one reason he moved to Boston, to give his life a fresh start in a new place. His arrival here certainly changed mine. So, there I was, ruminating about love and art and destiny, neglecting the womby scene of moist soil and the green sprouting things along the sidewalk. Blind to tree limbs gauzy with pale buds, unfazed by all the optimistic signs of springtime that pervaded my stroll, as though I could not believe that winter was finally over. That's when I found myself at the entrance to the studios of the Boston City Ballet. Parked outside the main doorway was Rafik's motorcycle, which I have nicknamed Big Red. The name comes partly from the color of the paint, and partly from those indelible memories of Rafik's courtship, when he'd appear unannounced, dressed in high leather and balancing the big red machine between his densely muscled thighs. At his request, I rarely visit Rafik at the ballet studios. He seems intent to keep his personal life, including me, separate from the ballet. That early spring day, though, I was waxing romantic, more so than usual, and I wanted to see him. Maybe the arrival of warm weather had got my vital juices moving again after a winter's siege, but I knew one thing: a whiff of my man would jazz me up that morning. I pushed my body against one of the massive glass doors and entered the building. The entire structure had been renovated recently inside and out, forged into an exemplar of late 20th century architectural safety. Every aspect of the new design had been color coordinated, thematically unified, and accessorized. I was certain that someone had used a computer to obtain such flawless and consistent results. It was a long way from the ballet studios of yesteryear, where numerous flights of creaky wooden stairs usually led to a musty old hall. A sense of history prevailed in those places, a lingering of old and sacred ritual. I wondered how the modernized surroundings of the Boston City Ballet affected the artists who worked there. Were their temperaments yanked out from the past, aborted from the long tradition that had conceived their art, and then flung down into the computer-assisted environment of today? Inside the austere lobby was another world, one unaffected by changes of season. Here was one open space and mundane bodies lacking all sentiment, but in pursuit of absolute beauty, catalyzed by music and refracted into grace and movement, kind of like a fabulous color and cut by me. The receptionist recognized me as Rafik's friend and told me that company class, which is the ballet class reserved for the performing members of a ballet company, was just about ready to break before center. I trotted up the broad stairway to Studio A, also dubbed the Grand Studio, where company class was always held. Even before I got to the landing, I could hear through the studio's open door the sound of a concert grand piano, slightly out of tune, but swelling and receding with musical phrases of oceanic dimension. Above that turbulent drama, I heard the strident voice of an old woman. "Stretch!" From that bestial wail, I knew that Rafik was not teaching company class today. I looked in through the open door. The stratospheric ceiling suggested a cathedral or else an airplane hangar. From windows cut into the roof high overhead, broad ribbons of yellow sunlight cut diagonally into the huge space and illuminated some of the dancers as spotlights would on a stage. The scent of clean sweat mingled with the pungency of crushed rosin on the raw wood floor. It had been one of the Boston City Ballet's most controversial extravagances to install hardwood flooring in the renovated Grand Studio rather than opt for the cheaper but more modern vinyl covering widely used in most other studios and on stages. Rafik had once remarked that dancing on unfinished wood was the best. The aroma and the texture of the long slats of pale wood over the expanse of floor did seem to maintain a link with the past. Perhaps history was still alive here, and after all, both in the flooring and in the movements being made up on it. There were about 45 dancers in the studio, 2/3 ballerinas and 1/3 ballerinos. Their attire ranged from classic black tights and white tees for the men, pink tights and black leotards for the women, to postmodern, shimmering unisex bodysuits of iridescent colors found nowhere in nature, not even in typical forest. Some of the dancers donned baggy cotton sweats, strategically torn to expose the critical knee and hip joints, and a few more, the more brazenly exhibitionists, sported flimsy shorts of skin-tight jersey and even skimpier tops, all sweat-soaked and showing the muscular workings of shoulder, back, chest, buttock, and thigh. All was inspired by a sophisticated pretense of modesty that created more eroticism that actual nakedness would have. Madame Ekaterina Rabinskaya, the aged ballet mistress of the Boston City Ballet, was conducting class, or more correctly, directing the show. Since the combined forces of music, color, and space made everything inside the ballet studio larger than life, like a cinemascope, technicolor, and surround sound spectacular, I had met Madame once before, back when Rafik first started working for the company, but I had never seen the old woman in action. Now she was supervising a complex set of stretches at the bar, the last exercise for the dancers before the center. Madame Levinskaya, or Rabi, as Rafik secretly called her, carried a switch of flexible, springy willow as she strutted like a field marshal among the dancers, ready to deliver a light swat to an unstretched knee or a raised shoulder or to any of a few hundred other ill-placed joints and muscles. Her clever eyes caught every movement in that cavern studio. Even the pianist watched her wearily as though she might deliver a smart slap to his knuckles at a wrong note or a missed beat. Madame noticed me too. The instant I arrived at the open doorway, she walked toward me as she screamed blood-curdling orders to the dancers. "Up is all up! Hold back strong is bush!" So this was art. She stopped at the open door and faced me directly. She was surprisingly short, so close up, and I felt myself drawn downward to her almost against my will. Her entire torso, bust, waist, and hips was homogenized into a single shapeless unit, but one that looked firm and strong despite its age. Her face was a prehistoric terrain, heavily coated with foundation makeup, a vain attempt to camouflage the ravages of time. But with no more makeup, her features receded into the mask that was her face. Only her eyes remained wide and alert. Our heads were suddenly close, and I could smell the soft wool of her wine-colored cardigan. She whispered like a conspirator, but I heard her clearly in spite of a rush of notes from the piano at that moment. "You come for Rafik?" Her heavy accent sounded like a bad parody of a Russian spy. I blushed and found myself speechless, a rare event for me. I glanced nervously at the slender willow shaft that quivered in her hand, ready to strike. I straightened up to military attention and forced a polite smile. "Yes, for Rafik," she responded with a sly grin and murmured, "Then I will not kill him today." She turned abruptly on her heels and screeched, "Again!" causing the piano music to surge with renewed passion. Madame strutted back onto the studio floor, and I felt a strange relief, as though I'd survived a surprise attack. How did the dancers endure this kind of treatment every day? If Madame Levinskaya's tactics were any indication, the abuse went far beyond muscle and bone. Perhaps a dancer's training required the unconditional surrender of the personality as well. With the threat of Madame's switch gone, I focused back on the activity in the studio. I scanned the bodies and saw Rafik stretching carefully at one of the portable bars in the center of the floor. Like a Persian prince or an Egyptian Phaimic portrait, Rafik has refined dark features whose chiseled familiarity is one of my life's pleasures. But I noticed some unfamiliar lines on his face too. Experience and disillusion was already marking Rafik's countenance, but his body remained supple. Like a cat, he is long-legged and equally clever with all four limbs. Sometimes during sex, I can't tell if it's a hand or a foot or a knee or an elbow that he's plying on me. And his male organ is like a fifth limb, one fluent in a unique kinesthetic vernacular. He can even make it dance, but then he is a choreographer. To reduce the strain on his injured hip, Rafik was working his leg on the portable bar's lower level. He slid the raised leg along the bar and stretched his thighs open to the limit of his split. He claims that it had once been perfectly open, an easy 180 degrees, but now it stopped short of 120. Perfect split or not, Rafik still possesses the lithe, sculpted muscles of a performing dancer. Besides, in the everyday world, what practical use is a perfect split? From far across the floor, Rafik caught my admiring gaze and replied with a wink. All was well between us. My crotch stirred too, the proof that I was still infatuated since hooking up with Rafik. I was generally in a semi-turgid state. In fact, to help check my newfound spunk, I'd even developed a new mantra. Quell the swell, quell the swell. But it really worked. Before my shameless arousal became noticeable to anyone in the studio that morning, I aimed my attention away from Rafik. Working opposite the bar from him and facing him was a young male dancer. I immediately noticed the similarity of his body to mine, though his was devoid of any fat. Still, I could see by his frame and flesh that he shared my tendency to retain weight. Someday, when he stopped dancing, he too would be plagued with those same 12 or so pounds that refused to leave my hips. Right now, though, his haunches looked fine, full and round and tight. His legs could have belonged to my twin, if he existed. Relative to his trunk, they were extra long and plump with muscle, especially the calves, and like me, he had small feet that were broad as a brick and had an aggressively high instep. There was, however, a major difference between me and my dancing doppelganger. His entire musculature was obviously rock hard, while mine is just pleasantly firm. With a little longing, I wondered if that young dancer represented my own body, if I had ever pushed it to the ultimate conditioning that ballet produces, but a sudden bark from Madame Lebenskaya snapped me out of my reverie the instant the music stopped. "Take away from the bar!" she commanded. Perhaps a finely tuned body wasn't worth the sacrifices required to attain and maintain it. Long before I had met Rafik, I'd learned from other dancer friends that all ballet classes comprise two distinct parts, bar and center. The bar, pronounced the same as the place where you can get a drink, is the first part of class, when the dancers perform their movements next to a stout wooden railing called a bar. The bars are usually attached permanently along the studio walls, but they can be portable and freestanding on the studio floor as well. The bar exercises warm up the dancers' muscles and develop their strength. The center, or center, if you want to be absolutely French about it, takes place on the studio floor proper. The center resembles a actual dancing when the dancers travel across the floor and through space, and they must rely on their own stability and strength. This is where the jumps and the turns happen too, along with the thrills and spills of classical dance. Rafik and the young dancer were about to move their portable bar off the floor, but another dancer, a lissome blonde ballerina, was still executing her personal version of the stretches, while the class disbanded for a short break, with most of the dancers pouring out the doorway and roughly pushing me aside with a kind of mob momentum. That singular ballerina blithely continued her graceful movements, bending backwards like a contortionist to touch the back of her knee with a softly held wrist. Rafik and the young male dancer watched her intently. Then their eyes met, and did Rafik just wink at him? Couldn't be. It was my insecurity at work again, misconstruing a wink and weakening my belief that I could be loved by someone like Rafik. His wink was more likely a wince of pain from the recent stretches, but then the young man made a remark, and Rafik responded with a generous smile and a comment that caused both the young man and the blonde ballerina to giggle. The ballerina pulled herself upright from her bent back position and retorted sharply, which caused both Rafik and the young man to laugh out loud. And throughout this brief vignette, to my shame, I found myself feeling alienated and jealous of their easy, playful camaraderie. Madame Rabenskaya, still holding the willow switch in one hand, stopped beside me. Upon leaving the studio, she looked down at my feet, then directed her gaze back into my eyes with a cold stare. "Is rubber," she said occasionally, accusingly. "Excuse me," I replied. "Your shoe is rubber." "Ah, yes," I said with another forced smile. I inverted one foot to show her the spongy white sole of my sneakers. She approved with a sharp nod. "Then you can go in studio." Her permission granted, she moved briskly on. My eyes followed her down the bright, wide hallway. She paused and turned back toward me in high profile. She tucked the willow switch under one arm, then fetched a package of cigarettes from a pocket of her cardigan. She lit up and inhaled deeply while she put the pack away. Then she exhaled a voluminous cloud of smoke. I watched her grasp the cigarette between her thumb and index finger and pull it smartly from her lips, as though portraying a tough from the old movies. I'd once seen John Garfield hold a fag just like that, with his palm curled protectively over the glowing tip. Madame retrieved the switch from under her arm, then resumed her deliberate pace toward a closed door a short distance away. Arriving there, opened it, and vanished within. A blue-white cloud and smoke was all that remained in her wake. Meanwhile, numerous dancers had settled themselves on the carpeted floor of the lobby. Some of them lay belly down and stretched into wide open splits. Some of them lay belly up, with legs propped up against a wall, and most of them, as though imitating Madame's example, had lit up and were smoking freely. Here were specimens of the most extraordinary physical development engaged in, if you could believe the Surgeon General, one of civilization's most hazardous pleasures. Even I had tried many times to smoke as part of my image as a hairstylist, but had failed. I could never achieve that cool, elegant poise that comes from truly enjoying a cigarette. I generally coughed and gagged, and I always get teary, like an oversensitive wimp. Just as I was heading inside the grand studio, Rafik emerged with a young male dancer alongside him. They both wore big, happy smiles on their faces. However, when Rafik saw me, his easy smile changed to a look of surprise, and not one of pure pleasure. The young dancer who'd come out with him eyed me cautiously, then moved away from Rafik and settled down on the carpet to stretch some more. Rafik approached me. "You are not at work," he said with his French accent. "The day is so beautiful, I thought of you." Rafik smiled cynically. "You are a romantic?" "So are you," I said, hoping for a hug or a touch. He shook his head. "None. I feel now, how you say, pragmatic." "Maybe you're working too hard again," he shrugged. "Work, life is all the same." Right then and there, at that horrible lapse of understanding, I wanted to hold Rafik close to me and make him tell me that it mattered to him, that I loved him, that I wanted to be with him forever, that I wanted to save him from the pit of pragmatism that he was plummeting ever deeper into. But he spoke first and stole the moment from me. "We must change our plans tonight." I sighed heavily, a sigh of exasperation. Rafik had already postponed twice an anniversary celebration we had planned to mark our first year together. Tonight was to be the third try, and I was beginning to sense that he didn't share my enthusiasm about our togetherness. He went on. "I have an important meeting with Max Hartke. He is director?" I know who he is. My gruffness surprised him. It did me too, but I had to resist his charms. Otherwise, I'd possessively accept yet another canceled date with him. Rafik continued quietly. "It is dinner," he said, then added, "You are invited." "Oh," I said with chagrin. "It is business. Maybe you have no interest?" Rafik pronounced the word maybe. "The new conductor for this season has arrived. We all talk about the music for the spring program." "Well, I don't mind as long as I'm with you. There will be much ballet talk. You will be bored." I had to concede a point there. For a non-dancer, there's almost nothing duller than being around dancers talking about dance. They'll blab endlessly about muscles and ligaments and body placement, like an open form in anatomy. At least when hairdressers socialize, they exchange juicy gossip, all sex and money. "Rafik, I'll even listen to dance talk if it means we don't have to cancel our anniversary again." "You think I do not have grief from that? I want to celebrate Stani, but I must do my work." He had cleverly used the nickname bestowed by my Czech grandmother. Rafik always said it correctly too, accenting the second syllable. Stani. Only 3 people ever called me by that name, and they all seemed to do it when they wanted to gain a point during an argument. "Rafik, would you rather I didn't come?" It was Rafik's turn for a heavy sigh now, but his was a sigh of deference. "Max Hartley has asked for you. We are dining at 8 o'clock at his home. He expects us at 7:30. "Where do you want to meet?" "Chez Hartke." "Why don't we go together?" Rafik set his mouth tensely and replied through his tightened lips. "I will depart from the studio." "Then I'll meet you here." "You should go there yourself," he said firmly. I wondered why he was being so difficult. Was it so much to expect that my lover might want me along on a social event, even if it was affiliated with a ballet company? I mean, were we a couple or not? I pulled out the small pad I always carry with me and asked Rafik for the address, then wrote it down. Just as I finished, Madame Rabinskaya arrived in the lobby where we were standing outside the studio. She was about to resume class. She said to Rafik, "You will do Adiago?" Rafik replied, "No." "Is most important part," she said, and glanced at me as though I would keep him from class. "I know, Madame," Rafik said, "but I must prepare for rehearsal." Madame Rabinskaya seemed to accept this reason. "And I must prepare your dancers," she said when Madame re-entered the grand studio, immediately following a flurry of cigarettes being extinguished in the lobby. Then all the sprawled out, slit open, curled up, or twisted dancers' bodies were on their feet and then back in the studio at attention. During the break, Madame Rabinskaya had exchanged her whip-like switch for a sturdy walking stick of ebony topped with a silver fanal. She used the stick to support herself in the center of the floor, while she set the first combination of steps, the Grand Adiago. Standing next to me outside the studio, Rafik watched her intently as she filled 32 counts of powerful music with space-filling poses and unexpected turns of body, eternal balances and sweeping circles of the upper body and arms. In spite of her ancient body, Madame had captivated Rafik's attention. He was lost in her movements the way I wanted him to be lost in my presence. When Madame had marked all the steps and poses, the large class split into groups and performed the difficult Adiago. Rafik said, "I must go. I have rehearsal. Can I watch?" He became almost violently defensive. "None! I have told you already, not this piece." Rafik was keeping his most recent work a complete secret from me since its conception many months ago. He had discussed neither title nor subject nor music with me. I was to experience this choreographic event along with the rest of the viewing public on opening night in a few weeks. Until then, I was to wait patiently and loyally, to tolerate Rafik's moods and his despair, and to love him unconditionally through it all, because he was a great artiste who had to do this great thing. Well, I'm just an ordinary mortal. I want flesh and blood man as my lover, not a creative demon. Rafik continued, "Today I am working with Tony." "Tony? The conductor from Italia." Tony? Could it be true? Could my old flame Tony, the former church organist and choir director, now an internationally acclaimed opera conductor, could he be in Boston to conduct for the ballet? Then why hadn't he called me, and why did Rafik's eyes twinkle at the mention of his name? "I know him," I said. "It's not him," replied Rafik. "It's she," he said emphatically, and with correct grammar, even if he had chosen the wrong gender. Then he pointed behind me. I turned and looked in the direction he indicated, expecting to see a sexy man, which my Tony certainly was. But instead, I saw a radiant and voluptuous red-headed woman approaching. She sure wasn't a ballerina. Not with that frame and that bosom and those hips, and certainly not with that walk. Everything, hair, head, shoulders, hips, thighs, all of it was moving in fluid figure eights. No ballerina ever revealed in her own flesh that way. A ballerina's body was an instrument of artistic expression, while this woman was obviously used to pleasure. Big pleasure, and lots of it. My suspicions that Rafik was hanging out with my former fantasy man were unfounded, and I felt stupid to have doubted him. Rafik introduced us. Her name was Tony de Natal. Then he explained to her, a bit glibly, I thought, that I was a friend, and I was just about to leave. "Here's your hat. What's your hurry?" Tony de Natal extended her big hand toward me. "How do you do?" she said with a husky voice that bore no trace of accent. "Hi," I said, taking her hand, which matched mine in size and strength. "I don't hear the sunny Mediterranean in your speech." She smiled broadly and replied with her dry contralto. "I was born in New York, but I spend most of my time abroad." "If anything," she said, and then changed her vocal inflection as she continued, "I occasionally lapse into high Brit." Then she laughed heartily and shook her head, and shimmied her shoulders, and tossed her mane of lustrous red hair, all with exaggerated playfulness. I replied, "My friend Nicole does that too. The Brit bit." Rafik interrupted us and said to her, "Shall we go to work?" "Sure," replied Tony, but her hips did most of the talking with the monosyllabic answer. Then she asked me, "Are you coming along too?" Rafik intercepted her question before I could answer myself. "No," he said sharply. All at once I understood how a woman might feel if her husband ever related to another man in a vaguely sexual way, and then proceeded to exclude her from their company. Rafik and I were lovers, yet this woman was attempting to arouse Rafik's interest, and was very possibly succeeding. And now he was trying to keep me out of it. Already the two of them treated each other with a familiarity that I had assumed was mine alone with Rafik. For the briefest moment I wondered if Rafik might be bisexual. After all, Ramon, the shampoo boy at Snips, claimed to be bisexual, and he was from Paris, which is where Rafik was born and lived before going to Montreal. Maybe bisexuality ran higher among Franciscophones. The awkward moment that followed Rafik's blunt no was broken by the voice of Madame Rabenskaya, braying from within the grand studio. "Stretch! Stretch! Stretch! Stay! Finish!" The music stopped, and there was silence. Tony de Natal remarked offhandedly, "She's a living relic." To my surprise, Rafik glowered at her. "Her family was favored by the Czar," he said in staunch defense of the old woman. Tony replied firmly, "The Czar is gone. The arts world needs people like you now." Flirtation disguised as fact and flattery. A tense frown creased Rafik's brow. Perhaps her adulation bothered him, or did he sense my uneasiness that they might have already done the horizontal tango? "Nice to meet you," Tony said to me. Then she hooked her arm into Rafik's and turned to lead him away. He looked almost helpless in her power, and no part of Rafik is ever helpless. "See you both at dinner tonight," I blurted. Tony de Natal turned back toward me with a big swirl, using Rafik's body as her pivot point. "Are you going too?" she said. "How nice!" But her enthusiasm, like everything else about her so far, was veneer. Rafik told her to go and wait in his small office just down the hall, where he'd meet her in a few minutes. "Don't keep me waiting too long," she said. "I still have jet lag." She laughed noisily, and Rafik nodded back with a big grin, one that I recognized from when he first seduced me. Tony de Natal continued on toward Rafik's office, leaving us alone outside the grand studios. Rafik waited until the music for the Adiago started again. Then he said to me, "I see what you are thinking." "What am I thinking?" "You think of sex." "That's right, especially sex with me, and how long it's been since that happened." "I wouldn't mind a little more interest from you. We are still lovers, aren't we?" Rafik stared directly into my eyes. "You hurt me with these words," he said. "I miss you when you are so involved in your work." "It will pass. But I want you now." "Tonight, Stanley, I promise. After dinner at Max Hartley's." Again, the nickname. I never liked the idea of making an appointment or a promise to have sex with someone I love, but I was lonely for Rafik, and he seemed to be spilling his affection everywhere but on the home front. "You still want to meet at Chez Harquis?" I asked. "Yes." Why was he insisting on separate arrivals? So, we wouldn't be perceived as a couple? Or was it just another odd way of punishing me for not living with him? "I'll see you later then," I said coolly. Then, as if to belie all our misunderstood words, we suddenly embraced there in the hallway. Holding each other close and hard, I listened to his breath, felt his lips graze the side of my neck, absorbed his moistness, took in his scent. Rafik's skin exudes miraculous scents. The lively citrus of bergamot, the cool green of clover, the pungent bite of nutmeg, the sweetness of vanilla. An olfactory smorgasbord that challenges me to keep my lips and tongue and teeth to myself when I'm near him. Holding Rafik for those few seconds outside the grand studio of the Boston City Ballet made everything in the world fine again. Never mind the axiom that says electrical vigor between two bodies must diminish with times. If Rafik was giving me a manicure, I'd probably climax 3 times. You'd better go change, I whispered. I don't want you catching cold in those sweaty duds. I left the studio and headed back across town to Snips. I was mildly disgusted by all the jealous turmoil I just put us through. I knew it was all irrational. If Rafik wanted to play around with anyone, the male dancers or the females, or even Tony Natal, for that matter, he'd had plenty of time to do it at the studio, so his suggestion that we arrive separately at Max Hartley's place must have been a matter of convenience and nothing more. I'd be better to focus my obsession on the nature of Rafik's secret choreography, the new work he refused to share with me, than to fret about his love. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.